Thank you. So I am Mark Collier with the OpenStack Foundation. For those of you who aren't familiar, the OpenStack Foundation is a nonprofit that we started about 4 years ago. I was actually working for Rackspace in Austin, not at this facility, but at the old one just down the road at the time, and spending a lot of time down at Castle and working on OpenStack really from the beginning, and then we decided it needed to have an independent home and a nonprofit. So we created the OpenStack Foundation and started off with only a very small team and a small budget, and it's grown with the project. We've had tremendous growth in terms of the number of contributors and members. We now have 80,000 members of the OpenStack Foundation in over 190 countries, which is kind of insane. It's almost every country in the world. And our team is about 25 people, spread out all over the world in 4 continents. So it's a small team to be very geographically diverse. So ironically, even though I live in Austin, I don't get to go to as many OpenStack events in Austin as I would like, because I'm on the road a lot, and when I'm here, I'm usually hanging out with my kids at home, but telling a lot of dad jokes. Yes, we'll get a few tonight, I'm sure. I'm happy to cover whatever you're interested in. I thought I would go through a few slides that we've actually been working on this week related to kind of overall industry trends that are happening in the cloud computing world, and how that affects OpenStack, the opportunity for OpenStack, and where we fit into the whole mix, and I'm happy to take questions anytime. We also have the 15th release of OpenStack coming up next week called Okata, and so that's pretty exciting, 15 on-time releases. Got a few highlights for the Okata release that I can go through as well. But in terms of just overall market trends, and I'm sure all of you are involved in this market as well and love to hear your perspective on it. But one of the biggest things that we've seen just in the past few weeks, if you look at the big hyperscale cloud companies, the Amazons of the world, and Google and Azure, Microsoft Azure, they continue to grow, and I think public clouds, the biggest public clouds, continue to grow, and I think every category when it comes to delivery models is growing right now, whether it's public, private, or hybrid. However, that growth rate in the public clouds does seem to be slowing, at least based on the recent earnings results for Amazon and for Google and for Microsoft. They all pointed to some potential trouble there. Again, it's growing, it's not shrinking, but the growth rate seems to be slowing a bit. And another series of headlines that caught my eye was about Snapchat. I'm sure if you have kids, they probably use it, but some kind of chat thing, I don't know, but it's very popular. And they are what you might call cloud native. They were born in the public cloud and they've stayed there. And part of their IPO filings, they had to disclose what their big expenditures were, and an insanely high amount of their money is going towards Google and, to a certain extent, Amazon. So I think what some of these trends point to is that when we talk to users, a lot of them tell us they're starting to get a bit of sticker shock when it comes to public cloud. It's so easy to get value from a public cloud like Amazon on day one. You instantly really get value from it. And a lot of people don't get that kind of value from a private cloud from day one historically, and that's why public cloud is very enticing. But after a certain period of time, you get to certain spend, especially for certain types of workloads, and it starts to become cost prohibitive. And what we've seen is that people realize that the premium they're paying for public cloud actually can really not pay off if they're paying for something they're not using. So if they're not turning on and off the resources day in and day out, and they have a steady state application, it may be much cheaper actually to run it in a private cloud. And one of the big things that's changed, that's made this possible, is kind of the evolution of private cloud itself. And if you look at what I'm calling here the Gen 1 private cloud, it was really kind of the beginnings of OpenStack 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago. There was Eucalyptus, there was CloudStack, there was VMware, a lot of ways to kind of get your feet wet with a private cloud. But it was really kind of virtualization plus. There were some aspects of self-service, but there was not as much knowledge about how to operate it. The technology was not very mature. I can certainly say from the standpoint of OpenStack, it was not mature. It was very difficult to get running. So in that sort of first era of private cloud, the people who were successful with it, which not everybody was, the people that were successful were the PayPals of the world, big companies that were tech savvy. Walmart's the largest company in the world. They've been very successful with OpenStack. They've run the last 3 Black Fridays on their OpenStack cloud. So the technology works, but it's not been as easy as it should be and as accessible as it should be, and that's why it's been prohibitive for people to use. And in this era, you didn't get a lot of value from the first day of your project. You probably spent a long period of time getting it set up and getting it deployed and sort of accessible to your users, getting your apps on it. And the biggest challenges were around the technology, but also the talent. Very difficult to get people that knew how to operate OpenStack 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And if you look at where we are today, really kind of in the past 6 months and really kind of where I see private cloud technology heading this year into this Gen 2 scenario, you've now got a lot more capability in terms of virtualizing the networks. Neutron, for those of you who are familiar with OpenStack, is the networking project. 3 years ago, it was very difficult to use, very complex. It was kind of overly ambitious to try to virtualize and automate the whole networking stack in the data center and to do it in a SDN sort of fashion. That's come a really long way, and it's a lot easier to use. We still have more work to do there, but there's a lot more use cases that are covered, and the reliability of it is carrier grade now. We have AT&T now running OpenStack in over 100 data centers. So if you have an AT&T cell phone service here in the US, it's probably routed through an OpenStack powered cloud. So it's come a long way in terms of the network reliability and scalability, number of data centers, storage. I think containers and bare metal are really the 2 hottest areas right now. Probably you've all heard the Docker hype and played around with it. And I'll talk more about kind of how containers are playing a big role in kind of evolving OpenStack to make it easier to manage. And I think, if you think about the control plane, one of the things, Rackspace, I know you're not all from Rackspace, but we're here at Rackspace, so I'll give them a hat tip of the hat, which is that they were one of the first distributions of OpenStack to containerize the services, put them into containers, and that really helps tremendously with upgradability. All the reasons developers love containers, the ability to package up the different dependencies and very, very quickly iterate and spin up new versions applies very much to OpenStack, and people think of running containerized apps on clouds like an OpenStack cloud, and that's definitely happening, but taking OpenStack itself, putting it in a container, and using things like Ansible, and as we move into the future, we're starting to see people using even more sophisticated tools like Kubernetes to manage OpenStack itself. This is a pretty powerful way to make this cloud platform, this private cloud system, a lot easier to use and upgrade. Upgrades have been at the top of our operator and deployer pain point list for many years, and we've chipped away at it, and you can do live upgrades on most of the services now. But containers are really, some people thought that Docker or Kubernetes or some of these technologies would be a threat to OpenStack, and what we're seeing is it's really a shot in the arm to making OpenStack itself easier to use. And we have a lot of great collaboration across communities that's happening. And so today and moving forward, some of the challenges people face are more on the culture and process side. So we had a user that implemented a private cloud and took their provisioning time down from 44 days to, I believe, 43 days. And they thought, well, it's not what we were promised. They weren't super happy with that. And it turned out that really, once they got to the end of their internal process of approvals and procurement, it happened within seconds or minutes. But it was really, they really kind of moved the bottleneck into their own, sort of revealed the bottleneck they had, which was left after they automated the data center, which was the process side. And then culture, I'm sure you're all aware of, how hard it is inside of some very large companies that have done things the same way for a long time to change the way you do things, networking teams that have sort of complete domain control over the network, and nobody provisions an IP without their say. That kind of thing starts to have to change if you're going to be able to give people self-service and provision their own networks. And it's a little bit of a mind bender for the old way of doing networks, but that's what people are faced with now that we have this much more mature stack to run a private cloud. And so as a result, what we're seeing now is a lot of the smart companies are getting more sophisticated about where they place the workloads. So I think for a while there's been kind of a debate. Is private cloud going to win? Is public cloud going to win? Is private cloud dead? What is... And the press in particular loves this kind of like, who's going to win narrative. And the reality is like cloud technology and programmatic infrastructure, like there's so much infrastructure we need to automate that there's no way there's going to be one model or one vendor that's going to dominate it all. That's crazy. I mean, we're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar IT market every year, and even if Amazon's at 15 or 20 billion, that's a drop in the bucket compared to the total IT market. So all of that hardware is eventually going to need to be automated, and there's going to be a need to do things in public, private, hybrid. It's really just kind of software that automates hardware at a fundamental level. So what we believe is, OpenStack is going to obviously benefit the more there are private clouds, but there are also many, many public clouds powered by OpenStack, dozens of them all over the world. And that's continued to grow. So it's not really an either or. It's more about most companies that we talk to are doing both, or they have plans to do both. And the next kind of layer that people are starting to get smarter about is what workloads make sense where. Cost is a big driver. And for those steady state strategic workloads that that are really important to your business, a lot of times those will end up on a private cloud. And it's not that public cloud's bad, it's a great thing. It's an amazing thing, but it's not always going to be the right choice. And I think I probably covered most of these. The cost savings one I've mentioned, but this is a couple of interesting data points. So Snapdeal, have you all ever heard of Snapdeal? Probably not. They're unless you're been in India recently, you probably aren't that familiar with them. But they are the largest e-commerce company in India. So if you're ever in India, they're huge there, and it's a massive market. They have 350 million users at Snapdeal. So they're the largest e-commerce player there, and what they did is they were running their business. It's actually a really interesting story. If you meet the founders, they worked at Amazon in the e-commerce group, Amazon.com, and they had gone to their management and said, we want to launch this kind of play in India, and I guess they didn't get the green light, so they left the company, decided to strike out on their own and start a company. So they started this Snapdeal business focused 100% in India, and it's grown to be massively successful there. And they were running it initially on a very large public cloud provider. And when they built an OpenStack cloud and moved most of their workloads over, they saw a 75% cost savings. So that's a massive amount of money that just dropped to their bottom line simply by building a private cloud optimized for their workload, moving off a big hyperscale cloud provider. So I think this kind of story is going to start to be more common this year. Well, I don't think we've heard much about it. If you look even just a year ago, there was kind of this common sense wisdom, I guess, or common perception that public cloud is cheap. And it's really not necessarily the case at a certain scale. And that tipping point at which it becomes less expensive to run a private cloud is going down over time because the technology and the options for how to run an OpenStack cloud or a private cloud are improving. PubMatic's another company that made this switch. And then the last data point here is from Volkswagen. They're the largest car maker in the world, and they have committed to OpenStack to modernize their infrastructure. And they've done some math around it and seen that it's 70% cheaper to run on their automated OpenStack private cloud than their classic IT. So in this case, they're not moving from an AWS to a private cloud. They're moving from sort of the traditional, not very automated. Hey, Dustin, how are you? Hey, Mark. To a cloud environment inside their own data center. So cost is something that I think is going to be on more people's minds. For a long time, the technology of cloud and sort of the mysticism around it kind of dominated everyone's talk. It's going to change the world and automate all these things, and it's cool and it's doing those things, but eventually it gets so important that the CFO goes, well, what is it going to cost? And they start to want to get involved because it's a given that you're going to run most of your stuff in a cloud environment over time. And the question is, which environment and what's it going to cost me? A couple of other data points from some people in the analyst community. 451 Research does a lot of work in this area, and they talked about how what they believe is once you get to the point where you can manage 400 virtual machines per engineer, per sysadmin, then you get lower cost of ownership for a self-managed cloud than public or managed cloud. And I think it's really hard to come up with the exact right number, but that's what they do for a living. So I think it's a good starting point. And this is another quote along the same lines. Another aspect that OpenStack has really started to take off for in terms of use cases, NFV. So this is a network functions virtualization. Basically, all the big carriers, the AT&Ts and Verizons of the world, they're modernizing their networks and really moving some of the biggest networks in the world into a virtualized space. They're going from their old model of having these fixed function hardware devices that were very expensive, proprietary, rip and replace to upgrade from 3G to 4G to SMS to MMS. It was a very painful model for them to much more of a software-driven model for their network and for the services they deliver as a business. And AT&T has said they want to virtualize all their network, I believe, by 2020, and they're on track to do more than half of it today. So they're in 100 plus data centers with OpenStack, and they're delivering this kind of they're achieving the dream that a lot of carriers have. Most of the carriers in the world, it's going to take quite a bit longer. They don't have the resources of an AT&T. It's a big world with a lot of carriers, but AT&T is doing a great job of leading the charge there, and a lot of people can benefit from that because they're contributing back. They have a team inside of AT&T that's contributing to the open source code inside of OpenStack and a lot of other work groups and so forth. And then the container world is very hot right now, and LivePerson is a company that's been using OpenStack for a long time. Kobe's spoken at a bunch of our summits, and you can find his talks online if you want to look at them. But what LivePerson does is if you ever go to a website, I think Time Warner actually uses them, a lot of places you probably use. If there's a chat box that says, talk to a live person, it's probably powered by LivePerson. That's the biggest company that does that. It's a SaaS business. They're based in Israel. And what they've started to do is run Kubernetes and Docker on top of OpenStack to give their developers what they want, which is a very fast environment to do continuous integration, continuous deployment, all that good stuff. So running Kubernetes on OpenStack is going to become a lot more popular the next couple of years. And then this is another area that probably isn't that foreign to you all, but sometimes people think OpenStack is just download the source code and hire a bunch of engineers and understand every line of Python, and you have to do it all yourself. And that's very much the exception, not the rule. In most cases, people will work with a distribution. I guess I should put Rackspace on here so I don't get thrown out. But it's just, there's limited room on the slide. But there are lots of great distributions of OpenStack. Managed private cloud, definitely a place that Rackspace has been pushing the envelope for quite some time. And what we're seeing as well, and in particular, I think Rackspace is doing a lot of work in this area, is the managing someone's cloud that's in their own data center. This is a fairly mind-blowing concept for people, but if you can actually get, a lot of people are enticed by the Amazon model because they're like, yeah, I hear what the trend is, which is I shouldn't manage this stuff for myself anymore. Why do I want to, this is not my core business, let someone else handle it. And so there's kind of this misperception that means is synonymous with public cloud. But the fact is you can get a private cloud, still have it in your own data center, get all the privacy, speed, and security benefits, and the cost benefits, and still not have to operate it. If you work with Rackspace, Mirantis, Platform 9, there's a bunch of companies starting to do this. And a lot of those technologies that make OpenStack more easy to manage also make it easier for these companies to provide these managed services. So you can actually really kind of have your cake and eat it too. And then of course, public clouds, there are many, including Rackspace, that run OpenStack. So that's what I had for kind of the state of the union as I see it in terms of the cloud market. And I think we should just stop here and take questions and have a Coke. What do y'all think?
OpenStack working, how do you see containers and OpenStack working together from a consumption point of view?
Yeah, so containers and OpenStack. From a consumption point of view, probably the project that's most relevant is Magnum, which has been around for a couple of years. Magnum is an OpenStack project that really is designed to take the container orchestration engines that are starting to get some traction out there, like Kubernetes and Docker Swarm. And what those tools do, those open source tools do, is they actually help you provision these pods of different container applications. So if you have microservice or distributed apps that are all in containers, they help you kind of manage those fleets and grow them and shrink them and reboot them or re-provision them if they go down. So they're very good at that sort of application level management. And OpenStack's about infrastructure. So what Magnum does is it kind of helps in an OpenStack native way provision Kubernetes on top of the OpenStack cloud. And so that's probably one example. I don't know if I'm getting at your exact question or not.
Question. So OpenStack is made of many projects.
Yes.
So we kind of talk about them as one thing, OpenStack, and one word for the release, whatever the name of the release. So do we see the trend that the people start taking some of the project kind of separately and start operating on them separately, not on the whole, similar to how kind of we started with Swift as an somewhat independent and be working very fine on its own?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, one of the things that we're going to be updating next week is the Project Navigator. I'll talk about it in a minute, but it's a really good point. I think that as OpenStack, so OpenStack first and foremost is a community of people developing software in a certain way, testing it in a certain way, releasing it in a certain way. And most people that want to use software don't care how it's made, so we don't always start with the how it's made piece. They just want to know what it does. And so we've kind of simplified it down and to talk about it as OpenStack as one thing. But the reality is, as soon as you get into it at all, you realize it's actually a bunch of different components, and you may not necessarily use all of them. And as kind of one level of an example, you might just take a combination of the different services, depending on your use case. If it's big data, you would add in the Sahara service and run Hadoop. And Sahara is a service or a project that helps you provision and manage big data tools in an OpenStack native way, so it does Hadoop and Spark. So that's kind of one layer of it. And to help explain that, we created this Project Navigator last year. It shows the different projects. It also has sample configurations of those combinations. So that's kind of one layer of it. And then what you're talking about is actually the next layer of kind of even harder to explain, but I think growing in use, which is people just taking maybe even one OpenStack project that just solves like a specific thing, or maybe one or two. And this actually does play out interestingly in the container world. So one of the things that's happening now is that a lot of the container stuff is very early, and very few people are running it production. But if you start to run real apps on it, you probably want block storage, and a lot of people in the container world are saying, okay, we got to go off and build this really sophisticated block store system, and then other people are going, well, there's this thing called Cinder, which is the OpenStack block store, has the incredible driver support for every block storage thing you can imagine. So people are starting to take that and plug it in. Keystone is another good example. You know, Keystone is the authentication service. People are starting to realize, well, if they have a bunch of other tools, but they just really need a authentication service, why not use Keystone? So people are sort of doing that a la carte thing, and we haven't quite figured out how to talk about it. That's the weird part. The Project Navigator is intended to help sort of people examine the things on a project-by-project basis. And next week, when the next OpenStack release comes out, we're going to be doing a revamp of this page. We're going to be adding more data, more projects. So hopefully that'll start to help people to grasp it, but it's a communication challenge for us at the foundation to explain, you know, all the different projects and when you'd want to use one for what. But I think the thing we often try to do is go with real users and have them tell their story. Like, I solved this problem, here's the projects I used, here's why I used them, here's what worked, what didn't. So we're going to try to do more of that. But I do think we'll see more of those. In the beginning, you know, when it was just 5 projects, Swift was the only one people ran standalone, because sometimes you just want object storage, and it's always been a little bit of an odd duck in that sense, in that it always sort of stood on its own. But we're seeing more projects being adopted, kind of a one-off.
Do you think the Apache Foundation has a model that sort of works from that perspective? There's a lot of Apache projects coming together.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that the Apache Foundation, you know, has the Apache way, which is kind of, you know, extremely important to them in terms of how open governance works and how the projects work. But they basically will tell you they don't actually care if projects succeed or fail, and they don't actually care if they're related to web serving, which was the original Apache mission. And that, I'm not criticizing that, but that's just kind of what it is. It's if you want that way of development, that's the place to go. And I think we're in an interesting point now where we need to figure out kind of, you know, which direction we want to go. But we have a mission statement. We have an idea about, you know, OpenStack as a framework for helping people automate their data centers at the infrastructure layer. So I think we have some much tighter definitions around what matters to OpenStack and to the foundation and Apache. And it's not that one's better or worse, it's just different in that regard. So I think that, you know, a project that had nothing to do with cloud computing and had no way of sort of advancing infrastructure as a service or anything in that area wouldn't make any sense to have in OpenStack. It might make sense in Apache. Yes.
So OpenStack's grown in popularity because it's very open. Like anybody, you know, it's like you can implement it a certain way. Competitors in the space, like corporate competitors like VMware, they're very prescriptive. Like, if you want to run our stack, HA, here's how you do it. You buy this model, you cable it this way, you put your rack configuration this way. Do you think OpenStack would ever get more opinionated like that over time? This idea of, hey, if you're a C-level leader at a company and you think you need an OpenStack, here's how you can get it in a much more opinionated way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think that to date, the primary way that's been addressed for people that want that is through the ecosystem of those distributions. So, you know, it's much like in the Linux space. You know, Red Hat got a lot of traction by being more prescriptive and being more locked down, and not necessarily the latest kernel, but you, Mr. Customer, don't want the latest. You want me to support this thing for years. And so that's kind of played out in a similar way. And if you look at a lot of the major players in OpenStack, it's Canonical and Red Hat, and the people that they're big in Linux and SUSE. So I think, you know, It's a good question. We have, I think, the sample configuration. Some of the there's been a lot of work that's gone on around like reference architectures. So I think we tend to be more laissez-faire in that sense of, let's get the people together who are doing things a certain way, have them document it, but not make it sort of the one true way, but just a way that's worked. And then other people that want to take something that's worked will take it and go. And it sort of becomes organically becomes the standard set of ways to do it. And, we could debate the pros and cons of that, but that's philosophically been the way it's gone within our community.
Well, do you think that's because they want to give you a certain I think.
We're recording it, so
Oh, okay.
keep the question.
Based on that, do you think what this gentleman was saying, that they are trying to give you a certain configuration for a production environment or something that's robust out of the gate versus having this laissez-faire approach, or just, a newcomer coming in, I'll try it this way because I've seen somebody else do it, and it's not HA, it's, there's some kind of single point of failure here, or it's improperly configured?
Yeah, I think that, again, you see companies that make OpenStack products. And again, OpenStack is not delivered in only one way. It's delivered, it's the same upstream bits, but configured for different use cases by different distributions, for example. So I think that many of those companies, if you go to them, will give you a very prescriptive solution that's powered by OpenStack that sort of takes away a lot of the knobs that you would be tempted to turn. So but yeah, I think that the reason why companies that aren't open or aren't building things in any sort of open way tend to make things more prescriptive is they got to support it, and they're just trying to kind of narrow the complexity surface, if you will. But I think you have that choice in OpenStack, and there's always going to be people who want to customize it to the nth degree, and they will take that option if it makes sense for them, and other people that'll buy the off-the-shelf product or the remotely managed service and never even see any of those options. Any more questions?
I think it get kind of answered by some of the others, but has there been anything that really talks about the kind of the cutover from public cloud to private cloud in terms of costs and where it really does? Because there's a few newspaper clippings here and there, but it seems like there's two big impediments to widespread adoption. One is kind of what I would think of as mean time to private cloud.
Yes, that's a great quote.
And really having that be turnkey. And it sounds like you're relying on the ecosystem to provide that, as opposed to really having that be a primary feature out of the box. But in terms of the cost comparison, once you go to those ecosystems, then you're going to start paying them on top of. So in terms of trade-offs.
I think that it's one of our goals this year as the OpenStack Foundation to help commission some of those studies and try to gather that data. We basically are at the press clipping level ourselves and anecdotally talking to these users and saying, why did you pick it? What are you running where? And sort of sharing that in real time. And that's just kind of as far as we've gotten with it. We've been talking with a lot of the analyst firms who love to do this kind of stuff. So we tried to dig up as much as we could that had already been done and shared a little bit of that in here. But I think it's something you'll see more analysis around throughout 2017. And we'll do it as much as we can in-house. We'll commission reports. We do a user survey. I should probably get a plug-in for that, which is open right now. OpenStack.org/user survey. If you're using OpenStack, fill it out. It gives us a lot of insight into how people are using OpenStack. That doesn't have really cost data in it, but it does give us other good data. We could put Dustin on the spot. He's with Canonical here and see.
I gave you the quote at lunch last week on this one.
Well, yes, okay.
Startups start in the cloud. Successful ones go private.
Here, you say it.
My name's Dustin. I work at Canonical, product manager around Ubuntu. We were having lunch and we were talking about this very topic, Mark and I. And what I told him is what we're seeing with large scale Ubuntu users who have 10s or 20s or 30,000 instances in Amazon or Google or Azure for that matter. Startups will often start in the public cloud. They'll scale out in the public cloud, and the really successful ones eventually in-house some portion, if not all, of that cloud at some point at 30,000 running instances. And I know of 2 immediate .coms that are users of Ubuntu, Netflix and Pinterest, that have that scale. They're running in the public cloud, and the cost is just exorbitant. It's absolutely exorbitant.
It's our ecosystem at work here.
I have a quick question. So I know when Google joined the foundation, I thought that was going to be like a Kubernetes slam dunk, like it's going to happen, and then it kind of hasn't really happened. How do you think, customers kind of either want to store data or run some code, right? And everybody's clamoring towards Swarm and Kubernetes as a way to make that easier for that person to do that thing. How do you see, like in the next year, like how containers would take off in OpenStack? Is Magnum like the way that you think this will there'll be more penetration of Kubernetes into OpenStack?
I think that it's interesting. There are so many different approaches right now. I guess you could say they're competing approaches, but there are a lot of different ways to get a containerized app into a cloud, including OpenStack, and they're all just kind of getting a lot of interest because I guess the potential value of the combination is so great. So it's kind of a good sign that there's a lot of competing efforts, but also confusing and maybe something that needs to consolidate over time. So I think that it's kind of too early to tell what will be the dominant way that people marry the technologies 18 months from now. There's kind of 2 layers essentially where people are starting to put containers in OpenStack. One is inside of OpenStack where you don't really see it as an end user, but it makes the operation easier. Canonical's been doing that for a long time. And then there's what's probably more interesting to most people, because there's a lot more developers in the world than there are people operating clouds, is what runs on top. So, I mean, I'm not sure what you meant by like Kubernetes being a slam dunk, but
well, I just meant like, so I think people had talked about containers in OpenStack for a while, but we didn't really, we went down like the LXC path with Magnum, and that went somewhere, but it wasn't really fast, or it wasn't exploding in growth-wise in the same way Kubernetes and Docker and stuff were.
Yeah.
And so what I meant by that was, with Google joining, I thought it meant that would sort of be a steroid shot on the arm for containers taking off faster in OpenStack. And so my question was mostly around like, how do you see that takeoff happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that's happening with our summits, and I'll get a plug in for our next summit, is in Boston, May 8th through the 11th. And hopefully you all make it there, but we're really making it into something that reflects how our users think about and evaluate and use open source software with OpenStack and other things. So for example, we announced today we're going to have some what we call open source days. So there's going to be a Kubernetes day at the summit. There's going to be a Ceph day at the summit, Cloud Foundry day at the summit. We need to get Mass in there. But we're starting to get, people don't just pick one thing, they run a lot of pieces together. So some of those discussions will be happening at that summit. And we also have another new event. Well, the summit's not new, but we have a new event called the Project Teams Gathering. It's happening next week in Atlanta, and she's actually the executive producer of it, Erin, for the foundation. This is a very small event, much different than the summit. It's just the developers, really, and a few operators. And we really basically broke out a lot of the stuff that used to happen at the summit for developers and moved it to a separate event, so that when the developers are at the summit, they have more time to talk with users. They were just being spread too thin. We kind of had this realization, like, we're flying developers to Hong Kong, and they're 2 rooms away from people they really need to talk to, but they can't see them because they're in other meetings the whole week, and it's like, that's kind of ironic. So we broke that out, and I guess my point is that a lot of these in-person discussions are where we'll start to get more traction on the best ways to interconnect Kubernetes, for example, with OpenStack. So I don't necessarily have a crystal ball on it, but I think that there's enough people using them together that it's going to become a much bigger part of the mix. And our user survey going now, we'll have results for in I don't know, a couple weeks, I think, maybe a month. And I've been looking at some of the early data, and we do see, Kubernetes keeps showing up high on the list of things people are running on OpenStack. So it's starting to happen. Yes.
So I was mentioning about Zune and Courier. I think they are picking up, right? Even Nova has got support for actually spawning off containers and stuff. So Kubernetes is more at the COE, container orchestration engine. So it seems like definitely containers are picked up in projects like Nova. They have support for it. At least the last time I attended in Spain, there were some talks about containers, Courier, and Zune coming in.
So this is kind of a few highlights that are coming in the Okata release, but it kind of touches on some of the projects. There are a lot of projects in OpenStack that have something to do with containers. So it's another thing that's hard to kind of summarize, but Cola is the project that originally was, and the purpose of that was to create some kind of golden images, Docker images of the different OpenStack services. So if you wanted to run them in containers, you could go get those Docker images from kind of a trusted source that the community had curated. Cola has since expanded out to get more involved in the actual orchestration of the control plane, and so there's Cola Ansible that became production grade in the last release, which was Newton, and now Cola Kubernetes first release will be out with Okata, so that's still very early, but that's at that control plane layer. And Courier is a really interesting project, and these are, as it says here, the projects with the most contributor growth in this cycle. It was only a 4-month cycle because of that changing the events. With the PTG now, we had to shorten the release cycle, so Okata is only 4 months long, but these are the fastest growing projects, and Courier is at the networking layer. It's basically a connector between Neutron and the different container networking stacks. So there's libnetwork that Docker is promoting, and CNI, I believe, is the other one, that the Kubernetes and kind of CoreOS, Google, Crowd likes better, and Courier supports them both. So it kind of is like a connector or translation layer to take the Neutron networking commands and translate them into something that will happen inside of each container. So these are all things that are happening at a pretty rapid pace. And then again, Courier's adding Docker Swarm support, which is a popular request. So there's a lot of activity, but it's going to keep going throughout the year.
Cola is actually installing OpenStack in containers. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's being driven by Rackspace is what I thought. At least most of the contributors are.
So yeah, there are a lot of different efforts to install OpenStack in containers. Rackspace was very early on with the what became the OpenStack Ansible, and that was really just kind of a set of shared scripts, Ansible scripts to install and operate and maintain your OpenStack images using Ansible. Cola is kind of a more formalized project within OpenStack specifically that started off as kind of the images. So it's kind of hard to explain because there's a lot of moving pieces and some overlap between the efforts.
Yeah, I can say Rackspace does contain all the control planes for the private cloud offering, but they don't use Cola. It's all driven through OSA.
Yeah.
I was just going to offer a couple of observations, not crystal ball, but just observations from the way we see, Canonical sees our Ubuntu OpenStack users using OpenStack, especially in production. From running the OpenStack services themselves, when running Ubuntu OpenStack, they're always deployed in a container. It happens to be a machine container, a LXD container, which is similar to, but a little bit different from Docker. The difference is that a machine container looks like a machine. It boots sbin init. It has cron, syslog. It's small. It's still sharing a kernel with the host, but for all practical purposes, it's got SSH. It can be managed by Puppet or Chef or whatever your configuration management. We've been doing that for about 4 years in production, and about a year before that in dev, and it's given us a real advantage given our customers a real advantage in running an OpenStack as if they're running those services on a VMware or in a virtual machine. So that's the only way we deploy OpenStack when we deploy an OpenStack for a customer. So that's one thing. From a control plane perspective, containers are the way to go. I promise you that. Whether it's Cola or the LexD style of doing things, use what fits you. The other piece that I just wanted to mention is the provisioning of containers. So your question about provisioning of containers. The Nova LexD project, which is upstream in OpenStack now, was an effort that we led to provision machines using all of the same OpenStack API. So the Nova API, give me a machine that has this much CPU, memory, disk, network on this network with this IP. But instead of giving me a virtual machine, a KVM or a Xen or a Hyper-V, give me a LexD machine, right? So it's a container, still the same kernel as the host, but it boots. It has an SSH, it has an IP address, its storage gets attached, etc. That's Nova LexD, and we've seen tremendous takeoff of our users using Nova LexD. For Linux, on Linux workloads, it's 10x faster, it's 20x more dense. It's really been a great advantage to be able to run that many machine-like workloads, but put them into containers.
So LXD, I didn't realize was only supported by Canonical only on Ubuntu. Is it true?
It's open source. It's Golang code. It's compiled. It's run anywhere. It's part of every Ubuntu installation. 16.04. It comes out of the box. I don't know if any other distros are shipping it. They're welcome to, but it's.
LXC is distributed on all, Red Hat, CentOS.
Yes, and LexD is LexC 2.0.
Playing with LXD and then realized very soon that I only use Ubuntu most of the time. So.
Yeah, so LexD is the daemon. We basically turned LXC, the thing that's been around for 10 years, we turned it into a hypervisor. So the LexD, the D in that is a daemon. It's a Unix, Linux service. The LXCs are the containers. So LXC are the containers, LexD is the hypervisor, and we basically copied VMware and ESX. And
Red Hat, CentOS machine, physical machine. I thought I would do that, but then I realized that.
You can run those in guests in LexD. So you can have an Ubuntu host running LexD, and you can run you can LXC launch images : and then CentOS, Scientific Linux, Debian, SUSE, RHEL, if you've got a license. Any of those run just fine inside of.
On a physical machine which is running CentOS,
Which is running in a.
I should be able to target that.
I don't know. I don't know about CentOS.
That is what sounds.
Okay, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think with LXC, it's been around. LXC has been around forever. It's 1.0 of what he's talking about. What we've seen is a lot of customers that like the OSA stuff sets up all the control planes in LXC. The idea is that if you're a site and you run Ubuntu or you run Red Hat, I don't care, customer, you can still run Rackspace Private Cloud on your distro of choice. We're just going to dump LXC containers into it, and that will power your APIs.
So one quick follow-up on the container question, because I think I may not have wrapped my head around this correctly, but the OpenStack position with containers is to take VM requests and turn them into containers? Or is it, so I'm a VMware guy, right? And VMware's position is we take containers and turn them into VMs. So I'm just curious if this is which way containers and OpenStack are flowing towards each other.
I think that we have 2,000 developers that contributed to our last release and 265 organizations. So it's not as easy to answer as if I were one company that employed all the developers. So the answer really is that every scenario you can imagine, people are experimenting with and trying. And there is certainly a capability using Nova, which is traditionally, the compute service in OpenStack that's primarily designed initially for virtual machines, and you can use a driver to a Docker driver or a LXD driver and sort of talk to the compute service and have it then on the back end provision a container. That's not the only way people are using containers with OpenStack. They're doing it in a lot of different ways, and in some cases they're using Magnum to, if they're wanting to standardize on like Kubernetes, for example, they're using Magnum to provision Kubernetes and then using the Kubernetes API to spin up pods, which then happens on top of OpenStack. So it's very difficult to kind of distill to one model because people are trying it in a lot of different ways, and it's kind of not as simple to say that there's one kind of position on how it's going to end up, being the most popular. I mean, fundamentally, a container is just a packaging format, and so it's so general purpose that there's almost no layer where you can't apply it and get something out of it. It just maybe many of those are going to be invisible to the end user.
Okay.
Yeah. Mark, can you comment on the Zune project and kind of containers on the bare metal trend?
Sure. Yeah. So Zune is a brand new project that I don't know as much about. It originally was the scope for this project was part of Magnum. So Magnum originally was intended to be kind of all things higher level container and OpenStack, and it was a little too ambitious for one team to go after. So originally Magnum was both this kind of installer for container tools into OpenStack and trying to be an API that sits above those that you talk to, that's an OpenStack API that kind of abstracts away the differences between container orchestration engines, which is a much more ambitious project. So that latter category is what became Zune. And there's a lot of interest in this project. Like I said, it's one of the fastest growing for contributors, but it's not, as far as I know, production ready. It's only had one release. So it's I don't know as much about it, to be honest, because we don't have people really using it yet. But that's basically what it is. It's a abstraction layer that sits above the container orchestration engines. And that's such a fast-moving space. I mean, the APIs that you're trying to abstract away are changing every day. So it's hard to kind of abstract that at this stage, but that's what they're going for in that team. Bare metal is definitely extremely popular in OpenStack. We're already seeing that grow in each user survey. So there's a project called Ironic, which helps you provision and manage bare metal. I think it's mentioned on another slide. But the biggest use case we see demand for is people that have a complicated workload where certain aspects of it, let's say the backend database, makes sense to have on bare metal for performance. Or if it's HPC, you might have GPUs in there, and you just want bare metal for performance. So you want that capability, but really being able to take that and connect it on the same network to other parts of your application that might be running in virtual machines or in containers in virtual machines. So being able to create a network layer that can span bare metal virtual machines and containers is kind of the holy grail. And you can do it today, but I think there's a lot more automation that's yet to come in OpenStack around this. And but that's, I think, where people want to go with it is one fabric, and regardless of where the piece of your workload or application should sit for performance or other reasons, it can, but it can still reach back across to other data sources that maybe aren't on bare metal. And so,
I'm just curious if we see uptick of the Ironic with Magnum, bare metal on top of that, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more of an experimental area in the sense that people are interested in it and they're kicking the tires on that model. I don't know. I think we'll know more after this user survey about how many people are actually putting that combination together. And one of the things we do, people that fill out the survey can mark it public or private and confidential. So sometimes we just get data we aggregate, but in the cases where we can actually get to know the users, we get just enough clues from their survey to follow up with them and say, hey, I noticed you're using Magnum and Ironic. Are you using them together? How are you using it? So there's kind of a discovery period after the user surveys close where we get to go get a lot more direct conversations going. So I don't know of anybody right now that's doing that, but I've talked to a lot of users that said that they want to do it.
I had a quick question. So ever since Rackspace started selling managed cloud or managed support on other providers, it's really scratched customer itches. They say, great, it's a multi-cloud world. This is what we want to live in, multiple providers. I know there was a big push for interop within OpenStack, this idea of like if you're an OpenStack cloud, your APIs conform to a spec and the client behavior is the same way or whatever. That's really hard. I mean, just speaking, knowing how the sausage is made here at Rackspace, our API is not exactly like HP's, not exactly like IBM's. What do you think? What do you think about the current state of interop and maybe the future state of interop of what OpenStack is doing or intends to do about that idea?
Yeah. So yeah, the interop efforts have been going on for, I guess, probably about 2 years within the foundation. Not necessarily just the staff, but the board and volunteers. And there's a work group that meets regularly. People from Rackspace are very involved, EGLA and others. So I think that it's come a long way. One of the things that we did in Barcelona at the summit was the interop challenge, where we basically brought we thought it was gonna be 5, and then it was 7, and it ended up being like 17 companies on stage. This was at least 15, I believe, laptops all in a row. It was insane live demo, and every single one of them was doing a live demo of the exact same workload on a real cloud. And we had to go, our production company had to go out and buy like all these extra switches so they could switch between screens and project it up live. So that was a pretty basic workload, but we showed that it was possible to run it on 15 different distributions and public clouds of OpenStack. So that, I think the previous work from this was called the DevCore committee. Now they're called the Interop Working Group. But anyway, they were doing a lot of work that was kind of defining the capabilities and the APIs you had to have. So kind of important groundwork, but I think this next sort of more, I don't know, real world application testing is a nice next step, so that the theoretical checklist of things you're supposed to have, well, does it actually work like that in the real world? Because it is very hard. So I think that we're gonna see more progress as we progress through that, because every company that was involved in that, they're not going to want to be the one not on stage the next time we do it. So it becomes a nice carrot and stick to be involved. So I know plenty of people that would love to talk to you about how to improve Rackspace interoperability. Starting with Monty Taylor. Do you want me to give him your number?
I've heard some words. Yeah, I've heard his words.
Yeah. And I also think there's another level of interoperability that's really interesting in the multi-cloud world, which is, how do you design and build applications that can run on Amazon, Rackspace, or Amazon, OpenStack, clouds, and Azure and Google, and people are starting to look at that as a smart strategy, and a lot of that requires restraint because there's some special feature that one provider has and the other doesn't have, and that's what sort of hook you in and makes it hard to move. But I think that people are realizing how much of their budget's going to cloud, and when they're told that the switching costs are really high, not necessarily just because of moving data is hard, but because of like technical decisions that were made. That's when the CFO wakes up and realizes that they really need to know what's going on with this cloud thing, because it's growing in their budget every year, and you're telling me I can't switch. That doesn't sound right. So I think we'll see more interest in kind of the interoperability between OpenStack and Amazon, for example. I mean, you probably have customers that want that.
Very much so.
Probably Rackspace probably has more maybe more customers than anyone that are interested in that. So I'm all for that.
All right.
Thank y'all.
I'll ask one more. I got one more.
Okay,
Last
half
one,
a question.
My previous engineering team, we took some components of OpenStack for a certain product and rewrote them in Golang for performance reasons. This is one of those hard things where there's such an ecosystem around Python and all these gates and infra, and but over time, eventually Python won't be the thing, right? How do you see, or what do you envision? How do you envision OpenStack as a large project evolving to account for that fact that new languages will come out, they might have performance benefits, or they gain market share, right? Python drops in market share, and developers now know foo instead, or whatever. How do you see that? How How do you see that evolving?
Sure. Is this working? So yeah, I think that we absolutely will see the support for non-Python languages in OpenStack projects in the foreseeable future. I think we probably should have already done it. Frankly, I'm familiar with that scenario you're talking about. I think that there were some personality conflicts and things that ultimately kind of slowed the inevitability, something that's inevitable, which is we should support multiple languages inside of OpenStack. We already have JavaScript in Horizon and a few other, sort of exceptions. So there was more. There were some very legitimate reasons not to rush into it, but there were some not legitimate reasons that were also driving it around, open source. There's always going to be some different strong-willed people that want to tussle over things, but I think we'll definitely see support for other languages in projects in the next, few months.
So related to that, so I was thinking that initially Python was used because it's even the DevOps folks can actually be able to go use that. Now we are going to try and introduce a new language or support other things. Wouldn't that actually be against that? Or, that was one of the reasons I thought, they wanted to go something like Python and not Java. And then this means do we have a pool of people working on Golang and other stuff? I think there's probably a larger pool of people, developers out there knowing Python.
Yeah.
But then.
Yeah, a lot of those reasons were given for not wanting to support Go at this time. Another reason was packaging, with distributions, because Golang's, moving fast and that's an issue and all. So there's pros and cons around it. But I do think that I don't know exactly why Python was the original language. I know that Swift, that was the original object storage project written inside of Rackspace and then open sourced, was written in Python, and the original Nova prototype that was written at NASA was written in Python. So it was like, oh, it's a love connection. Let's go make a cloud. So that became Python, just became the thing, and it was also fairly trendy, I guess, at that time. It was sort of the Golang of,
It's kind of a reaction.
2011.
It's kind of a reaction to Eucalyptus. Eucalyptus was a bunch of Java that a lot of people reacted to.
CloudStack was Java too.
Right.
Yeah.
As I recall, it was, let's standardize in Python so that DevOps operators can write this code and
Yeah.
quick and iterate quick. And I think the rule became must be Python when the rule should have been can't be Java.
Yeah.
Well, it's
No
funny,
comment, I agree.
It's funny you mentioned operators, because
yeah.
that's actually the reason why that team did what we did. We actually had a deployment story problem or a build matrix problem where it made sense for us to build the component in Golang and ship it to run on multiple different distribution versions, because it just works. As opposed to packaging up like Python that cares about glibc and all that stuff. So it actually made the deployment story for ops a heck of a lot easier to move to Golang, even though it meant it was a compiled blob that you couldn't debug while the system's on fire. But it was, 6
But
to
it
1
worked.
half
It was
dozen the other.
much
It had-
faster, as I recall.
and then we benchmarked it and we were like, wow, this screams. So yeah.
Well, I promised my wife I'd be home to tuck the kids in, so.
Thank
is
you
where I'm
so much for coming out. This is a really, really, really good talk. Thank you.
Will you post your slides?
Sure, definitely.